It is Wednesday, December 18th, 2018. My name is Ashton Ellett, here with another installment of the Two-Party Georgia Oral History Project, sponsored by the Richard B. Russell Library at the University of Georgia. Joining me today is Mr. Phil Kent. Mr. Kent is currently the CEO and publisher of Insider Advantage Georgia and James Magazine. He is also the president of Phil Kent Consulting, a media relations, marketing, and communications consulting firm. He is a past president of the Southeastern Legal Foundation, and he is familiar to most as a regular panelist on Fox 5 Atlanta's long-running Georgia Gang program. Last but not least, he is a proud graduate of the University of Georgia's Grady College of Journalism and Mass Communication, a degree he has put to good use as an editorial writer, editorial page editor, and political columnist for the August Chronicle for over 25 years. Mr. Kent, thank you very much for giving up some of your time this afternoon to talk history and politics with me. We really do appreciate it.
Thanks, Ashton.
I wonder if we could begin telling us a little bit about your childhood and your upbringing.
Well, I'm originally from upstate New York, and I was raised by a family that was, I guess you could characterize as Goldwater Republican.
Okay.
And of course, as you know, back in the 60s, Barry Goldwater was, quote, the father of modern conservatism in the political realm, and ran for president in '64. And I remember as a boy, I had my AU H2O button, Goldwater.
Right.
If you passed chemistry, you would know that. But anyhow, I actually was very interested in journalism at a young age. I loved to write. And one of the best journalism schools in the country was the University of Georgia. Still is, I may add. Mm-hmm. And so not knowing a soul in the state of Georgia, I applied to Georgia. And in 1971, I enrolled in the Henry W. Grady School of Journalism.
Right. So that brought you, all the way down from New York. And how was Georgia politics different from upstate New York politics as you found it as an 18, 19-year-old?
It's interesting because I knew that if I was to have a professional career as a political conservative, I'd probably find more hospital environment in the South. But up in New York State, it's one of the few states in the Union that actually register by party.
Right.
And they actually, aside from the Democrat and Republican Party, you had the Conservative Party, you had the Liberal Party, you had the Socialist Workers Party, mm-hmm. and on and on. I think there's about maybe 9 or 10 parties on the ballot. I could vote when I was 18. And so I was a member of the Conservative Party of New York State. And that's how I got to understand in my interest in politics, limited government, individual responsibility, the free enterprise system. And so I was kind of prepared to coming to Georgia with some of my roots already established in conservative thought and philosophy.
What drew you to journalism in particular?
Well, as I said, I love to write,
mm-hmm.
and I was a crusader, and I was even opinionated back as a teenager. And I said, I like reporting, and I did do some stories for the Red and Black, but I just enjoyed getting my opinions out there and trying to sway others.
Okay. So tell me, what was UGA like when you were attending classes?
When I went in the fall of 1971, I really enjoyed the campus. I stayed around North Campus a lot. Mm-hmm. I joined the Demosthenian Society, which is the debating society, which I really enjoy and would recommend to any young lady or man who was there at Georgia, because you get to argue all sorts of different points of view and learn mm-hmm. from all different points of view. I was in ROTC, so I was able to drill and fulfill my military commitment. So I knew a lot about the ROTC building, which is right next to the journalism building.
Right.
And I also, it was a very turbulent time when the left wing on campus was very militant. In fact, mm-hmm. the, quote, peace people, unquote, had bombed the ROTC building just before I had gotten there. So, and of course, when we were doing drills, often we were mocked and spit at and yelled at by the left. So I grew to have a healthy disrespect for the political left.
Well, what sort of activities could a conservative like you find on the University of Georgia campus in the 1970s?
Well, it's interesting because I really, as I say, enjoyed the debating society. I rapidly made a large circle of friends, whether it was in the fraternities. I'm a big Bulldog fan, so obviously enjoyed the football games there. And of course, there's so much to do then as of now in Athens, a wonderful town. And so some wonderful memories. I lived in a dorm, Payne Hall. And I think some of the friendships I made there on the university were probably my most important asset.
Were you a member of Young Americans for Freedom? Did you ever get involved in that organization?
Yes, I did. In fact, YAF, as we call it, Young Americans for Freedom, I was active when I was even in my teens in New York State.
Okay.
And so I actually was the state chairman for a while when I got to Georgia of Young Americans for Freedom. And basically that was, again, promoting conservative thought, ideas on the campus and battling through ideas the political left.
What sort of relationship did the YAF have with the Republican Party organization, such as it was in Georgia?
Well, there was a college Republican group when I was there in the 70s, and you'll laugh at this, but a lot of us conservatives thought they were too moderate, and so we thought YAF was a better vehicle.
Okay. So, when did you start writing the editorials for a living as a career?
Well, I wrote a little bit for the Red and Black, and then when I graduated, at age 23, I fulfilled my active duty requirements, and you'll get a kick out of this story. I was ready to find a job, and the publisher of the Augusta Chronicle had called the placement service at the Grady School of Journalism and said, I'm looking for a young man right out of college to write editorials who's a conservative. And they said, that's easy, we only have one. and so I was hired at age 23 to write editorials for the Augusta Chronicle.
So was that Mr. Morris?
That was Billy Morris, the publisher of the Chronicle. And he became like a father to me over the years. And that's where I developed my writing skills. And back then, papers had some money to spend on journalists to travel. And so I was very fortunate to go to different foreign countries where I could write about not just national but international affairs. And basically, I got to interview the captains and the kings. You know, in journalism, that lets you go to any sphere. You could go to a barbecue, and you could go to the country club, and everything in between. The poor people loved you, the rich people loved you. And so journalism, to me, was so fascinating, and I enjoyed learning about public policy issues and interviewing people so I could write better editorials.
Situate for me, if you could, the Augusta Chronicle in the sort of Georgia journalism milieu of the 1970s, with the Journal and the Constitution here in Atlanta. What was the newspaper business like in Georgia in the 70s?
Well, it was big business, and it was very lucrative for the owners. And remember, this was an age before social media and the laptop computer and mobile phones and all of that. And that was often the only game in town, and it certainly was. It was the second largest newspaper in Georgia when I came there.
And the oldest.
And the oldest, established, there's always some controversy, but we always believe it's the oldest. And it was also a politically conservative newspaper as opposed to, say, the Atlanta newspapers. And it's an interesting history. When I landed there, the paper actually endorsed Strom Thurmond in 1948 for the states' rights Democratic nomination, which was a break from the Democrat, obviously, establishment of the time. And then, of course, it turned Republican in 1952, going with Dwight Eisenhower. That was pretty revolutionary back then. And also in '56. And then it continued its Republican trend. It was a very states' rights oriented editorial page under previous editors before me. I became the editorial page editor in 1981, but I left I became editorial page editor in 1982.
Okay.
I left in early 81, got back in late 82 after a stint in Washington, D.C.
That was my next
as
question.
press secretary to the late Senator Strom Thurmond.
How did that come about?
Well, those of you who know geography know that North Augusta is in South Carolina, and that's Aiken County and Edgefield County, where the Chronicle had a lot of circulation. That was considered the main newspaper for several South Carolina counties.
Okay.
And they all traveled to Augusta. And so we were very pro Strom Thurmond with a lot of his, especially national defense views and some of other views. And so he loved our editorials. I got to meet him. I got to meet his wife, Nancy. And we struck up a friendship. And when he had an opening, right after Ronald Reagan's election, he hired me as his press secretary, so I went to D.C.
So you were a press secretary for Senator Thurmond. Republicans are in the majority in the Senate, which was a novel concept at the time in 1981. What was that transition like, going from editorial writer, reporter, to press secretary up in Washington?
It was an interesting transition, and of course, I was trained to ask the tough questions and to find out as much as I could for the reader and in the interests of the people's right to know about public policy. And so the flip side of the coin is now I'm working for a U.S. senator, yes, a public official, and basically I had to give as much information as I could to the working journalists who wanted to find out everything. And the first thing that Senator Thurmond and I talked about when I was hired, and I was interviewed by the late, great Lee Atwater, who was a big lieutenant of Senator Thurmond and later went on to become head of the Republican National Committee after the 88 election of George H.W. Bush. But I vowed, and the senator agreed, that I would never lie to a journalist. And so that was kind of rule number one. And rule number two from the senator was, yeah, but you don't have to tell him everything. And so, but we got along fine. And he was also, at that time, the head of the Judiciary Committee.
Right.
So that's when Ronald Reagan was nominating a lot of the judges. And those were heady times with the Reagan administration. And really, I completely changed, as you know, the political dynamic.
Well, Sandra Day OConnor was nominated right around that time.
That's right. It was that spring.
And Russell Foundation's Powell Moore was the legislative liaison for Ronald Reagan's White House.
It was a little different time too, as a footnote, because as you may remember, Senator Fritz Hollings was the other senator from South Carolina.
Right. Democrat.
He's a Democrat. And yet, I got to see the constituent service between those two offices. In fact, Senator Thurmond's constituent person was in the office right next to mine, in the Russell building, I may add. And they worked seamlessly together. No one cared about politics. If a veteran needed help with the VA, both offices would pitch in. Senator Thurmond often referred to himself as the third senator from Georgia. And we would often work with the U.S. senators from Georgia to help people, say, over in Augusta or elsewhere. And yes, there was partisan division, but the constituent service actually worked very well. I'm not so sure it's working as well today, but that's a story for another day.
Sure. Well, Senator Thurmond and Herman Tallmadge, distant cousins, distantly related. So, you mentioned you were only in Washington a brief time. What brought you back to Georgia?
Two things. They never could find a replacement for me to really run the editorial page at the Augusta Chronicle. I had a young son who was still in Augusta.
Sure.
And there is a degree, and we know this today in politics, there's a degree of burnout.
Sure.
If you're a press secretary, it's often 24/7. He was a very prominent senator, being the head of the Judiciary Committee, and of course he was a longtime head of Armed Services. And so I still enjoyed my writing somewhat. I would, of course, do the press releases. I would help him with his speeches and columns. But there was a pull back to Augusta. And I also knew that, that Washington, D.C. then and now is really not a great place for a family and to raise a family. and it's expensive then and now. And so I enjoyed my time up in D.C., but it was time to go back to Augusta, and so I was named editorial page editor.
Okay, so you didn't catch the Potomac fever. You came back. What's the difference between an editorial writer and a political columnist? The sort of transition you made in the late '80s, early '90s.
Right. The editorial is an institutional editorial. And so you don't sign an editorial. Now, yes, my name was above the masthead along with the publisher and the other editors and officers. But the good news about Billy Morris, the owner and publisher, and myself is that we agreed, believe it or not, on probably 95% of everything, whether local, state, and national. And that, I didn't realize at the time, that's very rare in journalism. And I enjoyed that. In fact, when I was interviewed, I always remember that I answered the question correctly, and a lot of editorial writer applicants did not. Billy Morris asked me, would you write an editorial for this newspaper that I assigned you if you totally disagreed with it? And I said, yes, I would, because you are the owner, and this is your newspaper, and you're paying me to write it. And he says, that's the right answer. And I also said, I think after this interview, we agree on 95% of everything. And he said, well, you're also right about that, it sounds like. So, but that was a very pivotal question that I answered correctly. So as a political columnist, as you well know, your name is on that column, your picture probably is running with that column,
Right.
And that's your opinion. But editorial writing is you're writing the institutional opinions for the editorial page. We believe this, or we oppose this.
Right. So how much interplay, relationships did you have with other political columnists, other editorial writers throughout the state?
Well, I enjoyed networking with all of those folks in the journalism world in the Peach State. In fact, I became active in the Georgia Press Association in the 90s. I served on the board for a while. I attended faithfully for decades the Georgia Press Association annual convention at Jekyll Island. And so I got to know so many of the editors and publishers from all around the state, friendships that still survive. Some of those folks have retired. I've seen some of their children grow up. And so I really enjoyed that aspect of networking with other journalists around the state, other columnists and regular news reporters.
So let's talk a little bit about your experience outside the newspaper business. When did you get involved with the Southeastern Legal Foundation?
You know, I was probably right at the peak of my career in Augusta. And I was thinking, you know what? I need to start another chapter in my life. And I've gone as far as I can go. And also, I did sense that it wasn't like the good old days of the 1970s.
Right.
This was a business model in trouble. And I remember asking in the year 2000, I said to Billy Morris, I said, how are you going to be making money in the digital age? And that was a big controversy in all the newsrooms and the publishers' offices. And they weren't quite sure. And of course, that was the advent of the internet.
Right.
And plus, to be blunt, I needed to make more money. I loved journalism, but had a family, and I needed to strike out to the big city. And so the Southeastern Legal Foundation fit my philosophical bent very well. It's a constitutional public interest law firm that's still in Atlanta to this day. And they needed a voice and a face. And I thought to myself, I can be their voice and their face. And it helped me with all of my political contacts that I made in Augusta.
Sure.
Because I had statewide contacts. And so I figured, you know, that would be a great move. It would be a very nice salary that I could enjoy. And that would be a great, great segue to a new chapter in my career.
What sort of cases, you mentioned, you know, it's a conservative, constitutional focused organization. What sort of cases did the foundation take on while you were there?
It was a fascinating time. It was perfect for me to come right then and there in 2001. You may remember the McCain-Feingold campaign finance reform.
2002.
That's exactly right. That was a big one that we had. We had some private property rights cases. We had in the city of Atlanta cases where impact fees were being improperly used in the business section of Buckhead. We sued on that. We would hire outside attorneys. I had a panel of attorneys that would vet the cases, since I'm not an attorney myself.
Right.
So I had, it was fascinating to listen to the attorneys vetting the cases, but I actually got to hire Ken Starr. Does that name ring a bell?
It does.
I hired him as our attorney for the omnibus McCain-Feingold lawsuit. We had plaintiffs from the left, the right, and everything in the middle. I think there were 16 or 17 plaintiffs. And I was like herding cats when I was on those conference calls with those attorneys. And they would chit-chat and say, how you doing? And how's your family? And I'd say, guys, you know, we're having to pay for this. Can you get to the point here? I often learned how lawyers build. But those were great times. In fact, we lost that omnibus case. Southeastern was a major player with Mitch McConnell. Mitch was basically our voice and face in Washington. Worked with Mitch McConnell, got to know him, a smart strategist. I learned that back in 2002, 2003. And of course, we fought John McCain tooth and nail. We had some reverses, but I like to say, as I look back now, that we were right, and that basically the McCain-Feingold case, our case, revolved on free speech. We thought it impinged on free speech. That was perfect for my journalism background, and that's why we had a lot of liberals along with conservatives who were free speech crusaders.
Right.
It was an interesting coalition.
How different was the Southeastern ruling from Citizens United, which eventually cleared away?
You know, there's a lot of similarities
McCain-Feingold.
because in Citizens United, money is speech.
Right.
And that was the predicate of both of those cases.
Going back to the old Buckley v. Vallejo.
That was when it all started in 1976. You know your history.
Like I said, they come and take my diplomas away from me. So you go from Augusta Chronicle to Southeastern Legal Foundation, and then to Turner Broadcasting.
Well, let me correct you on that.
Please do.
Let me correct you on one. That is the other Phil Kent. There were two Phil Kents.
Oh, good gravy.
In Atlanta. And so you'll have to correct that opening. But we got to know each other because our mail was confused. And he was politically liberal while I was politically conservative.
That makes a lot more sense.
Yes.
And I'm going to edit that out because I'm not. You know.
I didn't know whether to stop.
No. We'll go ahead and edit that out.
Yes.
Let me get a time. That is bizarre that actually. I was like, that is a strange career move, Phil.
I could tell you some stories about that.
Oh, I'm sure. 45. Okay, so tell me about Insider Advantage and how you got involved with that organization.
I will. After I left Southeastern Legal Foundation, though, before I got involved with the Insider Advantage, which is a daily internet online news service, I took a deep breath. I had several clients that said, Phil, we want to use your PR and media and marketing expertise. And so I stitched together about 3 or 4 clients and struck out with Phil Kent Consulting.
Okay.
And so I started that in late 2003, enjoyed that. I got to have some corporate as well as political entities that I helped. And then Matt Towery, who you know very well from Georgia Republican history.
Sure.
He was the 1990 lieutenant governor candidate. In fact, when I was editorial page editor, we endorsed him for lieutenant governor. I believe, and I tease him to this day, I believe we were the only newspaper that endorsed him for lieutenant governor. But we carried, I know, the Augusta area. but basically, Matt came to me, I believe it was in 2014, and said, you know, I'm looking for someone to take over Insider Advantage and James Magazine, which is part of the company, and the Southern Political Report. And he knew of my journalism career. He knew that he wanted a journalist to run it, and he had other. He was an attorney. He was an author. Matt has a wonderful resume, and so he brought me in, and then I became the CEO on January 1st, 2015. Have been enjoying it. I got back to my journalism roots. I still have Phil Kent Consulting, and I still have a few boutique clients. But I'm spending a vast amount of my time now with the Insider Advantage Company. We've hired some writers. As I say, we do a daily internet news service, email blast, and we update our website. We cover the legislature. It's basically business, politics, and current events. And then there's James Magazine, which is defying the odds. It's a great niche publication. Over 10,000 of the most influential Georgians get it. That's our business model.
Right.
We plug in influential people, and the advertisers love it. You can check out insideradvantage.com, and you can see the digital magazine, a shameless plug.
No, I guess that's a good follow-up question, though, is do you think that the niche nature of James and to a lesser degree Insider Advantage is what has made the model successful as opposed to a larger media organization?
I think you just hit that on the head. Yes is the answer. I think that with the breakdown of the mainstream media, with the more polarization of the country politically, what we try to do with James is we try to keep it, even though everybody knows my politics, we keep it down the middle. We have pieces by Democrats, Republicans, independents, libertarians, vegetarians, you name it. And we try to cover things that often aren't covered in the mainstream media, or we're responding to things that are in the mainstream media, but hopefully we're doing some interviews or we have some insights and inside information that the mainstream media doesn't have. And so I think people are yearning for that. Our circulation is up. You can buy subscriptions to Insider Advantage, and you get James free. And then, like I say, a lot of times we'll just get James out there if someone is involved in business and politics, especially how they intersect. We can talk about that forever.
Right.
But that's what makes it a niche publication, I think, because a lot of business folks don't fully understand how politics works for them or against them. They're learning now, especially in the age of Obama and Trump.
I think most people probably recognize you from Sunday mornings on Fox, the Georgia Gang. I know that was the first time I ever saw Phil Kent and Dick Williams and the rest of the gang. How did you get involved with that program? And you're still involved in it, so
Right.
Tell me about that.
Well, I met Dick Williams when I was still over in Augusta. And I remember in 1998, someone had gotten sick that week for the Georgia Gang. And Dick, of course, we agree on a lot of politics. And he said, hey, you want to ride over and do the Georgia Gang? And he said, I don't have to prep you. You keep up with politics all over the state, and here's the agenda. I'd love to. And so I rode over. I remember it was 1998 when they were impeaching Bill Clinton. And so we had a lot of fun, and I enjoyed it. And so when I got rid of the Southeastern Legal Foundation mantle and assumed my own consulting firm, he said, you want to come on as a regular? There was an opening in late 2003. So I've been on the gang ever since then. And I tell you what, I think it's a wonderful way to get 4 different perspectives, or 5, depending on the number of panelists. And sometimes you surprise your audience. Sometimes it's not ideological. It's just basically common sense, or it's basically right and wrong. Corruption's corruption. And so it was perfect for my background and commentary. And so Dick Williams stuck with me all these years. I'm still on the show Sundays, Fox 5 at 8:30.
Has the program changed at all in that 15 years that you've been a regular?
Actually, no. It's been a panel-type discussion, as you say, hosted by a longtime journalist veteran, Dick Williams. And now, we are modernizing things over the past year. We actually have a producer, and we have video for the first time. What a breakthrough.
Right.
We've entered the 21st century. We're very pleased that we hired on veteran TV reporter Lori Gary as part of the gang. And in fact, this is a footnote, Lori and I knew each other back in the 80s when she was a TV reporter in Augusta.
Oh, there you go.
So it's good to be reunited with her. So yes, it's still the interesting dynamic of different perspectives.
Let's go ahead and zoom out a bit and talk about Georgia politics and how you've experienced and lived it over these last several decades. Why do you think Georgia Democrats were able to hold on to power so long in the state of Georgia as opposed to South Carolina, Alabama, Tennessee? What made Georgia Democrats and the Georgia political system different?
You know, there's several factors on the growth of the two-party system and with the Republicans finally coming into their own. As you know, 1964 was a pivotal year in Georgia when Barry Goldwater won the state and one of 7 states. And of course, that was the advent of the modern conservative Republican wave. But the wave didn't survive after 1964. Right. And I know you've extensively researched this, and the reasons are some of what you've already written about and researched about, and that is the courthouse crowd, the good old boys often referred to, heavily Democrat. And you've got to build a party from the local base upward. And the Republicans had to struggle. We could go through various cycles just very quickly. 1974, the year that Richard Nixon had to resign the presidency. That, of course, was a big blow for the Republican Party, not just in Georgia, but nationally. They struggled. You remember Machine Gun Ronnie Thompson, the mayor of Macon. He was the gubernatorial candidate that year in 1974. Wiped out, 70-30, I believe it was, but anyhow.
Yep.
And then you look, though, at the Southern strategy. I mentioned my friend Lee Atwater, the late Republican strategist. He worked with Ronald Reagan. You had Gerald Ford in 1976. Reagan lost the Republican nomination, but then 4 years later, you had a lot of events. The country was moving rightward under Jimmy Carter. His various, you could say, foreign policy failures, some of the domestic problems, inflation back then. I remember buying my first house. The interest rate was horrible. Anyhow, but all of that said, Reagan was elected in 1980. That really boosted the Republican Party chance and was breaking in various areas like Cobb County, Richmond County, elsewhere, the power of the Democrat courthouse. Sheriffs were being elected who are Republicans. That was big.
That's why I was going to ask, what made 1980 different from 1964? Why were Republicans able to sustain some gains from 1980 that they weren't able to sustain in the 1960s?
Well, you remember the Georgia Democrats realized quickly that the National Democratic Party was really moving to the left.
Sure.
You had George McGovern, at the time a very radical Democrat, in 1972. And they were very quickly, the Georgia Democrats realized, we're going to have to call ourselves Georgia Democrats. You remember a governor like Joe Frank Harris didn't want to even endorse a national Democratic candidate. You had many of the state lawmakers saying, I'm conservative, I'm not from Washington, D.C. And so they were able to hold on with that Georgia Democrat label for longer than in other states. You didn't have like in South Carolina, you didn't have an icon like Strom Thurmond as the leader. Now, yes, eventually you had the victory of Mac Mattingly in 1980, but the party still had to struggle right up until we only had Newt Gingrich for a long time was the only Republican congressman. You had the late Pat Swindle.
Till 1992?
92, and then 94, of course. That was the year that the Republican Party really was competitive at the state level. It still had to struggle for a few more cycles. Guy Milner almost won statewide twice. And then you had, of course, the big breakthrough with Sonny Perdue beating the incumbent governor, Roy Barnes, in 2002.
Why do you think the Republicans were able to consolidate power so quickly and completely in Georgia after 2002? We were talking about struggling in the 70s and the 80s and building in the 90s, but after 2002, 2003, state government fell pretty quickly to Republican control, and Republicans have yet to relinquish it.
It did, and I think there were several reasons. And I think the Republican Party had a message. The Democrat Party was struggling to hold together a coalition that was bound to collapse.
The night and day coalition.
That's exactly right. You had your country Democrats typified by Tom Murphy. They were a dying breed. And then you had the Black Caucus that had a lot of different agenda items, and they had to work it out. And it was getting more and more difficult as the cycles went to work that out. And of course, the dynamic was whites were leaving the Democrat Party in droves and becoming Republican. And because it was harder and harder for the Democrats to present a more fiscally conservative image. They tried, but you really can't compete with the Republicans. And they were recruiting some great candidates too. And so that was and when Tom Murphy lost, that was the end.
You sort of alluded to this already, but some have argued the Georgia Republican Party's approach to governance since 2003 hasn't been that different from a Joe Frank Harris, from a George Busbee. How has the Republican governing agenda been similar to those sort of Georgia Democrats, and where have they diverged?
Well, it's an interesting question. I think the small business people realize that Republican policies of reduced taxes, less regulation, less big government, less spending would help economic growth in their businesses, whereas increasingly the Democrat Party was becoming known as the party of big spending, big taxes, and the center was not holding as the years went by. And so you didn't have Democrats like Joe Frank Harris anymore who campaigned on no tax increase. And you didn't have a Zell Miller who basically had a lot of fiscal conservative. We had AAA bond ratings under a lot of Democrat years as well as continuing under Republican years. Now, the Republicans did emphasize some of the red meat social issues. And so and that tied in with the Southern strategy back in the 80s and 90s. And so you had, perhaps just to take some quick examples, gun control was a big issue in Georgia. The Democrats, probably because of the more liberal base in Atlanta. Atlanta was really a millstone around the neck of the Democratic Party with a lot of the liberals. And so you had things like that where Republicans resonated with a lot of the middle. A party wins with who you get in the middle to side with you. I think the Republican Party, even to this day, is pivoted very effectively, for the most part, as a center-right party. Whereas now, and I know you probably want to get into this a little later, the Democrat Party is not pivoting as well to centrist. You could argue with that to some extent, but I think it's still true. I don't know if it'll be true in the next few election cycles.
Right. Well, I guess.
But right up to now, I'm going to hold to that view.
Well, I mean, we could even debate. Are there swing voters? Are there true swing voters left in a polarized electorate? And you're right. We will talk about it. I don't want to jump the gun on that. But how has the Republican Party changed since the 1970s, the 1980s, and how has governing changed the Republican Party in that time?
Well, you made the point, governing, and that's the key. Campaigns are one thing, and themes and slogans are one thing, but governing is another. Now, yes, they have a set of principles and philosophies. I think you could take several sectors. Let's take the judiciary. The Democratic Party in the 80s and 90s and right up to the defeat of Roy Barnes as governor, they were rewarding the liberal base with judgeships. That was the big thing, and that was infuriating a lot of people. With liberal rulings that were unheard of back in the 70s were starting to occur in the 80s and 90s. There were some, in my view, horrible judicial picks. And so that was one factor that helped the Republicans, because Republicans then and now believe in strict construction, and whether it's the state constitution or the federal one. There were other areas, for example, education reform. The teachers' unions, while unions are banned here in Georgia, you had the GAE, the Georgia Association of Educators, an arm of the liberal National Education Association. They were becoming a very powerful coalition partner of the state Democratic Party. They wanted nothing to do with school choice, for example, something a lot of everyone, African Americans, whites, you name it, people like parental choice when you have bad schools in bad neighborhoods. So I could go down the list of various policy divisions that the Democratic Party was not connecting with to the general electorate. There are swing voters in certain circumstances. I think even to then as of this day, education. sees a lot of people. I think the Republican Party cleverly has positioned itself as the party of education choice. And you heard that in the last gubernatorial campaign, for example. And so the Republican Party has kept its business roots. They've managed to keep the religious right, which is a very important component of their
We haven't even
coalition.
talked about that.
It's a very important
the divisions
component.
within the.
They've
tell me
managed
about
effectively, though, to keep a coalition of business people, the religious right, and what I call some independent voters that may not be all that conservative, but they're fiscally conservative.
What's the biggest danger to, in the same way the Democratic Party of Georgia wasn't able to hold on to its fragile coalition? What's the biggest danger to the Republican Party holding together that coalition that you just mentioned?
I don't see the danger except when it comes to pulling out the vote, because they have nowhere to go. The left, and I don't want to be melodramatic, but the Democratic Party is becoming very hostile to religion. And you saw even booing at the Democratic convention of the word God. The Democrats were wondering if we should keep the word God in the platform. That shocked a lot of moderates and independents. And so you need to protect religious liberty. You may not get everything you want, but I think the Republican Party, even moderates understand this in the Republican Party. We need their votes. We're respectful of religion, and I think that coalition is going to hold. I know the left tries to divide it and call names and to the religious right, but I think they're going to be solid voters. In fact, to take an example of Ralph Reed's Faith and Freedom Coalition, they faithfully provide votes in key elections. They do scorecards. And where some of the Republicans might fail in some areas, they're going to pass in others, whereas the Democrats now are failing in almost all areas.
Well, you mentioned two things there: RFRA, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, and then the Faith and Freedom Coalition. Josh McCoon, former state senator from the Columbus area, a big proponent of the RFRA bill in the state legislature. How is Governor-elect Kemp going to, in your opinion, finesse that issue, his promises that he made to the Republican base, but also, as you say, work with a business community that may not be as open to or accepting of a RFRA bill here in Georgia?
I think what Governor Kemp has to do, and I think will do, is you take your best shot. And as long as your base, in this case, let's say the religious right, understands that he took his best shot, and win or lose, I appreciate that.
I see.
And so, and the business people still, with the Democrat Party becoming, I never thought I would see this. The Democratic Party is having trouble with those who believe in free enterprise as opposed to socialism and the command and control economy. And so I think the Democrat Party has far more problems holding together its coalition. I know a lot of liberal Democrats that are very concerned about socialism. And they don't want Canada. Even Stacey Abrams flew too close to the sun, I think, if you read her website, on some of these command and control socialist ideas, Medicaid for all, for example, which business people, liberal and conservative, understood would bankrupt Georgia. And so I think that Brian Kemp as governor, nothing's easy, but might have a better time holding his coalition together than the Democrats.
So you think the sort of the factionalism within the Democratic Party that we're seeing between the left, the Democratic left versus the Democratic liberal and center, there aren't too many conservative Democrats left, just as there aren't too many liberal Republicans left, like back in the 70s. Do you think that's going to play out so you think that's going to play out at a state level too? Sort of the way like the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in New York.
The days of the centrist, whatever you want to call them, Democrats are dead. The Michelle Nunns, the Jason Carters, and I think that Stacey Abrams, the Democrat candidate this last time, made a strategic error. She had effectively gotten the votes of millennials and some suburban women, and yet when she, in my opinion, gave such a shrill speech and blasted Brian Kemp for running an election that was unfair and rigged, I think that turned off a lot of what maybe we were calling swing voters, including some Democrats. I think if she'd been more gracious and didn't do that concession speech, I think that hurt her. I think that may have other Democrats learned. In fact, several Democrat leaders, from the respected Representative Calvin Smyre to the House Democrat leader Bob Trammell, they all said, we have to work to govern, and we just can't ruin Georgia's image as a place where we had a rigged election. And so there was a division. It's kind of underreported, but there were some prominent Democrats that did not like what Stacey Abrams did at all. They felt that it hurt the party's outreach.
Well, let's talk about 2018 a little bit more in detail in a second, but stepping back to 2016, the elephant in the room since 2016 has been Donald Trump. Sort of an all-consuming topic and personality. But what has Donald Trump's impact been on Republican politics here in Georgia?
I think that we could spend hours analyzing that, but I will say this. He has injected into the Republican Party in the state of Georgia and nationally a dose of populism that was needed. Now, I know that can be a loose term, but I do think that it appeals to a lot of people who may have felt forgotten, the forgotten middle class. The middle class declined frighteningly under the last Bush administration, the last term in 8 years of Obama. It was a terrible time for the middle class. The middle class shrunk. This is the strength of America. Workers thrown out of their jobs, plants moving out. I mean, I think that the Republican establishment didn't fully address that. Neither did the Democrat establishment. So you had a very interesting dynamic of a billionaire who really didn't care about the establishment of both parties, and he connected in ways that, say, in the Republican Party, John McCain or Mitt Romney never could connect with the average worker. In fact, in my lifetime, I never heard a Republican presidential candidate say, "We are now a workers' party." He hijacked a lot of workers in Georgia. Did you look at the rally just before the December runoff in Macon, where Donald Trump had pulled out, 10,000 people at an airport hangar?
Yep.
I've never seen a politician do that. Maybe George Wallace here back in the late 60s or early 70s. Never seen anyone do that.
Well, maybe that's a good segue into 2018, because the conventional wisdom, at least in the gubernatorial race, was that Lieutenant Governor Casey Cagle would be the heir apparent to Nathan Deal, who are relatively popular incumbent, two-term Republican. What happened to the Cagle campaign, and what enabled Brian Kemp, Secretary of State, to sort of come from behind or come out of nowhere, as much as a secretary can come out of nowhere, to seize that nomination?
I think there's several aspects. Likability. I think Brian Kemp, rightly or wrongly, is perceived as the more likable of the candidates. And his advertising campaign with his very charismatic wife, Marty, and he's got 3 beautiful daughters, that really appealed to a lot of people. I think, secondly, Casey Cagle, and this is very underreported, he made a lot of political enemies, even in his own Republican Party, as the presiding officer of the Senate. Year in and year out, he would horse trade with Speaker Ralston. He would have to tell some Republicans, "No, that ain't going to happen. Yes, I'll support you if you do this for me." The usual horse trading that goes on. This is not illegal or unethical or anything like that, don't get me wrong, but you make political enemies.
Especially over 12 years.
That's right, and if you hold up a bill on school choice or something, that means a lot to a lot of people, you build up that. Whereas Brian Kemp was yes, he was Secretary of State, but he was the, quote, outsider, and he very cleverly pivoted to the right because he knew the Republican electorate.
How important was Donald Trump's endorsement of Brian Kemp? Was it decisive, or did it come at a point where it was simply a coup de grace?
The polling showed, and I was looking at the Opinion Savvy polling, 2 weeks, maybe a week and a half before the Trump endorsement of Brian Kemp, Cagle was starting to crater.
Was that because of the Tippins, the Clay Tippins
Yes,
recording?
there was that defeated Republican candidate, Clay Tippins, exposed Casey Cagle in a very damaging tape that he was just an opportunist. And Cagle never responded effectively, and you could see his numbers cratering. Remember, Donald Trump likes winning, and so he knew that he might have had a winner there. And of course, you had Sonny Perdue, his agriculture secretary, former governor of Georgia, telling him, this is our guy. You had David Perdue, this is our guy. Nick Ayers, this is our guy. And so I think the word coup de grace was good. He wanted to make sure that the president wanted to make sure that his rural base knew that Brian Kemp was his man. And that helped, especially with a narrow election, it helped.
Were you surprised at the extent of Secretary Kemp's victory, 157 counties?
I was not. I would constantly tell my Republican friends, oh, we're going to win, we're going to win. Wait a minute now. There's been some demographic changes here. We have problems with suburban folks who's they don't have a rural agenda. I think Republican, being a PR person, I think Republican messaging was not all that great. Finally, Brian Kemp pivoted to explain health care. He had a very good health care plan. He just never talked about it. I think Karen Handel, who was defeated for Congress, never talked about how she would relate to the average kitchen table issues of the average person. And I think the Republican Party, every party after losses have to do a post-mortem. I think the Republican Party is understanding that we got to get back to those basic issues, just like the Democrat Party has done over the election cycles, that we have to try to appeal to these different groups that are in our coalitions more effectively. And I will say this, the Democrat Party targeted voters very effectively. They put in a lot of money into the Abrams campaign. They didn't put the money into the runoff, and so they were defeated in those two runoff campaigns. The Republican vote came out, and there wasn't the targeting of the Democrat vote.
You know, we were talking about the Republicans, but on the race on the Democratic side, Stacey Evans and Stacey Abrams, it was really a showdown between a new style of Democratic politics in Stacey Abrams, a sort of base-centric model, versus, as something you mentioned before, a we'll call it centrist, moderate Democratic approach of Roy Barnes, of a Buddy Darden, of a Michelle Nunn. Were you surprised at the results in that primary?
No, and there's the racial dynamic that is going on in the Democratic Party. Stacey Evans has a very compelling story, a mom, a lawyer, wife, former legislator. But you remember that was the time of the black woman magic. And you remember at that left-wing Netroots conference when Stacey Evans tried to present her platform, the radical left, many of them black radicals, shouted her down. She couldn't finish her speech. Those were Abrams supporters. Abrams tried to deny it. But that set a tone for the Democrat gubernatorial primary, and Stacey Evans never recovered from that. And Stacey Abrams never condemned the disruption of the Evans speech.
Were you surprised at, you spoke of the tone, especially the Netroots, which was a real flashpoint. Were you surprised the Democratic Party was able to come back together so quickly to put up a relatively strong challenge in the general election?
No, because opposition, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And that's what happened after Evans lost in the primary. And of course, the state and national Democrats were ginning up their fundraising against Donald Trump and the rising radical right and whatever their cliches were at the time. And so that was a great unifying factor. And of course, there's a pride in an African-American woman, a very competitive candidate for governor. And so you would naturally expect the African-American electorate to be responding positively to a Stacey Abrams.
We've already mentioned it before about the suburbs. The core suburbs, DeKalb County, Clayton County, turned bluer. Gwinnett and Cobb, which both went for Hillary Clinton in 2016, went for Stacey Abrams by large margins, 57% in Gwinnett, 54% in Cobb. What do you think is driving the suburban trend toward Democratic candidates?
Population, as you well know, in the last 10 years we added another 1 million people in metro Atlanta. Who are these people? And that's what both parties had to figure out. And we've seen all sorts of analysis from the apartment dwellers and people who were not, felt like they were not in touch. They didn't have the roots of people maybe that are native to the area. And so they had different agendas. The suburban has a different agenda than the rural person. And so with Brian Kemp had a winning rural strategy, but of course Republican support hemorrhaged, as you point out, and they lost some of those Atlanta House area, House seats, state House seats.
13 state House seats.
That's right. So that's why the Republican Party is pivoting, and why the Democrat Party has to also think about, you know what, how do we break into votes outside of Atlanta?
Do you think those trends are likely to continue, the suburban shift towards the Democratic Party and the rural shift, although I don't know how much more a Banks County, for example, can shift to the Republican Party, but rural Georgia shifting more and more towards the Republican Party? Is that a trend?
Yes, and I think as the left-right division gets more stark, and it will get more stark, especially with the 2020 campaign, with some very, very ultra-liberal and even socialist candidates vying for the presidency, and with Donald Trump, running for re-election from what we can see right now, the polarization will continue. The distrust of the news media by a lot of people, not just conservatives, but there's a lot of distrust of the news media. And then you've got, and I don't know if the Republican Party can pull it off, you've got to appeal more to the suburbanites, those apartment dwellers. And of course, I don't know if the Democratic Party can pull it off in Georgia, but you can't be as shrill and militant as Stacey Abrams was in that very damaging concession speech.
If you looked at the highest vote getter, Gary Black, Agriculture Commissioner, got about 53% of the vote, down to the lowest Republican, either Chuck Eaton or Brad Raffensperger, 49 and change. Very little drop off, very little split ticket voting. Was that surprising to you that there wasn't more ticket splitting, or is that just
it really
a
wasn't?
bygone era?
I thought maybe there might be 3 or 4% that you could sway, and it depends on the messaging of both parties. And I think that the ground game, as I mentioned earlier, was better by the Democrats, and I think that turnout is the key.
Right.
And so both parties went extra mile to get out their base, but the Democrats did a little better, especially as we saw in that 6th district where you had suburban voters that turned or didn't turn out. We still have a terrible turnout percentage in the state of Georgia. It's one of the worst states in the union in terms of turnout anyway. And so both parties had to struggle against that.
Do you think that the fact that this was a midterm election, which turnout's going to be historically lower, that 2020 is a presidential election year where Democrats tend to turn out in higher numbers, should that be concerning to Georgia Republicans?
Yes, although it works both ways too. There'll be more of a Republican turnout. And again, so it might be a mirror image of just who gets their base out and who targets. For example, you can hold up your iPhone and now it said, you have not voted yet, but your polling place is at such and such in Sandy Springs. You have until 7 o'clock at night.
Micro-targeting.
You're micro-targeting. I'll tell you a quick story. A friend of mine had just bought a house from an African American, and he had just moved in, and he had his Republican yard signs out, but he saw a car during runoff day, and it was a Democrat worker. And he went out and they chatted, and he said, I may be wrong, I'm confused. This address is supposed to be a Democrat household. And my friend said, you're right, but I just bought it from this guy
They hadn't
a couple
updated
months
the
ago.
list.
They didn't know. But that shows how effective they were watching who hadn't voted.
Right. So we talked briefly about the runoff. Republicans continue dominance in runoff elections. Again, I think there was 22% turnout instead of 66. But what are the positives and negatives that Republicans and Democrats can take from that runoff for Secretary of State and Public Service Commission?
Well, the Democrats, for whatever reason, we could go into several, I guess, but they just didn't have the money, as I pointed out. And a lot of times they knew that the turnout would be down. Republicans traditionally get out the vote. And so I think that there was more exhaustion on the part of the Democrats. They felt good. They won some big ones in November. And political scientists will tell you, you know this, the most reliable voters are your hardcore conservative Republicans. They'll crawl through broken glass to try to get to vote. And that may be changing somewhat, but it didn't change for that runoff.
Were you surprised, Brad Raffensperger, really tried to play a hide and seek game. He just really kind of stay out of the spotlight. Gave up the Georgia press debate with John Barrow, where John Barrow got to debate an empty podium. But at the exact same time, Stacey Abrams is announcing a lawsuit against, I believe, the Secretary of State's office, that there wasn't more coordination between Stacey Abrams, who had demonstrated to be a very strong vote getter. There wasn't more coordination on her behalf and the Barrow campaign's behalf.
That was a rare case of where there wasn't any solidarity. And it's funny because John Barrow, the last of kind of the prominent white Democrats in the state that held a major office, he was a congressman, as you know, for several terms from Savannah, Augusta, and Athens.
Everywhere.
But some of the blacks didn't like him, including former State Senator Charles Walker, who did a Facebook post urging African Americans not to vote for John Barrow. Now, I don't know. Every vote counts in a runoff, but there wasn't, to your point, there wasn't the solidarity.
Right.
And Brad Raffensperger, as a journalist, I'm in favor of debates and getting public policy issues out there to everyone can air. But as a consultant, I would say he probably was pretty smart.
Sure.
John Barrow was a far better debater than Brad Raffensperger.
Looking ahead towards, we're about 27 days from the beginning of the legislative session. Not that I'm counting, but what do you think Brian Kemp's transition team and his legislative floor leaders, what does it tell you about his governing priorities in his first legislative session?
Well, the new governor has laid out several things that we can already parse over, and that is that he wants to continue the great economic growth and jobs growth that has occurred under Governor Deal. And of course, we mentioned earlier the AAA bond rating, which is very coveted. I don't think, 8 states only have that?
A handful.
Yes, yeah. And so we're very, very privileged to have that through Republican governance and smart business decisions. And we have a great economic development team that is produced. And so you can tell that Brian Kemp wants to continue that. I think appointments are very important. And he signaled that he wants to continue again in some of the great managerial picks that Governor Deal did. I don't think the Democrat Party really inspired confidence in who would lead the Environmental Protection Division or the judiciary. The Republicans still emphasize that the courts have really come under what I call a more strict constitutional philosophical framework over the last 2 Republican governors. And you've seen a lot of decisions. The Court of Appeals and the state Supreme Court are now dominated by Republican appointees. Now, yes, judges are supposed to be nonpartisan and they're elected nonpartisan, but there is a philosophical difference, as you know. And so I think a lot of people who probably believe that there's too much permissiveness and too much crime, they probably like Republican judicial picks. Brian Kemp knows that. What was his big theme? Let's crack down on the violent gangs. Stacey Abrams really didn't talk about the violent gangs. This state, if you listen to the GBI director, if you listen to some of our district attorneys, Democrat and Republican, gangs have been out of control, especially in the metro area. Crime has always been an ace in the hand of Republicans. Democrats, rightly or wrongly, have perceived as being soft and permissive on crime. So Brian Kemp is emphasizing these issues. He's emphasizing, of course, trying to help rural Georgia with whether it's broadband or with jobs or with infrastructure. So those are just basic themes that Brian Kemp is saying all the right things.
How do you think, we already mentioned the 13 Republican defeats in metro Atlanta. They picked up a couple in the Athens suburbs. So a net gain for Democrats of 11 in the House, 2 in the state Senate. What those changing caucuses, Republicans becoming more exurban, rural, Democrats becoming increasingly an urban and suburban party. How do you think that's going to change legislating in Georgia compared to the last few years?
Again, I think that the Republicans, and you're seeing signs as we interview today, that the Republicans are pivoting more toward the needs of suburban people. I think congestion, as we all know, in metro Atlanta is a big issue. I think the Republican record, and Brian Kemp has emphasized this, with, say, public-private partnerships, where we get some of these giant construction projects that are paid for in part by private industry as well as the state. I think our transportation planning, while not the best, but has been far better the last 8 years. And finally, you've got planning now whereby I think people are feeling partially that their needs are being addressed in the suburbs. We've got a long ways to go, but I don't think the Democrats, and this can change because I'm not saying they're anti-transportation reform, but they didn't have a coherent message, at least under Abrams. Now, another Democrat could be totally different. And there's a lot of Democrats on board with a regional approach where counties can work together and plan together. That could be a rare bipartisan approach.
Well, what do you read into, as a Republican, as a conservative, what do you read into the Democratic leadership race, the Bob Trammel's race to be the minority leader against Carolyn Hughley of Columbus, a strong Abrams supporter, one of her lieutenants when she was minority leader. What do you read into the fact that Bob Trammell actually expanded his margin of victory within the Democratic caucus?
Well, I think if you're trying to be objective, if you've got a leader like Bob Trammell who just won some victories and expanded why do you want to throw him out?
Sure.
And I think there were some respected people. It was a rare division in the Black caucus. You had respected people, again, like Representative Calvin Smyre,
Sure.
the Dean of the House. He stood with Bob Trammell, and he argued, why do you want to throw this man out? And plus, we have to have a coalition. He's one of our white guys that we love. What are you doing? And so I think, I'm paraphrasing these arguments, obviously, but I think that argument won the day. I think the party chairmanship, they have to be very careful. How radical do you want a chairman to be? Democrats still have to rely on a portion of the white vote. And you can alienate white liberals if you get too radical. So they have to be careful.
How have the 2018 election results? How does that shape up Georgia for 2020? Either in the presidential election year, David Perdue's running for re-election. How does that set the tempo for 2020?
Well, I think people in both parties will tell you that it's very difficult to unseat an incumbent unless something major has happened, a scandal, a terrible vote that's come back to haunt he or she. David Perdue is a very strong politician, and he's got a strong fundraising apparatus. I think you're going to see more money pour into Georgia, just like you saw unprecedented money in this last midterm election that we talked about. I think you have to give the edge to Senator Perdue. I think there's a lot of Republicans who appreciate the fact that he's a businessman who was trying to look out for the interests of especially those we're talking about in the quote-unquote political center. He has support not just from conservatives, but from a wide spectrum. Constituent service is still important. If you've helped a farmer, get his bureaucracy straightened out and his farm loan straightened out, or a veteran, or somebody who's trying to place someone for adoption, and if you've helped them, that means a lot.
What do you think becomes of Stacey Abrams and her extensive network of supporters and backers here in Georgia and nationwide?
Well, the Abrams folks are energized, and I think that maybe that could be transferred to, say, someone like a John Ossoff, if he wanted to run again. Of course, he was the defeated Democrat candidate
Sure.
a year ago against Karen Handel. And so he will be a player, I think. Stacey Abrams has got some decisions to make. Does she want to go against a strong David Perdue with a lot of money, or maybe she's thinking Brian Kemp could be really damaged, and maybe the Republicans will suffer more losses, and maybe the demographics will break more toward me. She's probably rolling that through her mind.
Sure.
And so maybe I want to take a shot again. Second time could be the charm, but she has to stay relevant, and that's a difficult thing for someone who's been defeated. And so how is she going to do that? Now, I notice she's doing ads urging people to sign up for Obamacare, which is smart. She's staying out in front of the public eye. But then so are the others, the John Ossoffs. Maybe there's someone out there, maybe there's a great white hope in the Democrat Party that may want to appeal in a biracial coalition who's acceptably liberal, and maybe they think maybe that'll appeal, to a broader electorate, especially if more Republicans are going to come out to vote in 2020.
What's the state of the two-party system in Georgia? Before 2018, we would say it was probably pretty anemic in Georgia, especially after Republican victories up and down the ticket. What's the state of the two-party system?
It's never going to be the way it was in the 70s and early 80s. The PACs in both parties have become very dominant. You could take examples in both parties. Look at the hammering that Lieutenant Governor candidate David Schaefer took at the hands not of the Jeff Duncan campaign, but of the Duncan-aligned PACs. It was the most incredible, and of course you could argue David Schaefer waited too late to respond to the attacks. So the PACs are going to remain huge in terms of negative advertising, tearing candidates apart. People don't like it, but it has a big effect on the electorate.
Well, what's next for Phil Kent? You working on any stories, got any big projects that we should keep our eyes on?
Well, thanks for asking. I'm still enjoying my PR company. In fact, one of my clients is a cityhood client, the folks over in East Cobb. I don't know how that'll turn out, but I've always been a big proponent if an area wants to have local control over local affairs, that they ought to have a shot at it through referendum, of course. It has to pass the legislature, and then it's up for a vote of the people. So that'll be a fun client. And also, I really want to grow and build Insider Advantage, how we started out the interview. I love that company. It's still my journalism roots. I want to grow James Magazine. I want more advertising. I want more subscribers. I'm having fun with that, and I get to meet so many people. Democrats, Republicans, and Independents. We just had our James Magazine Influential Georgians event, as you may remember. We honored Nick Ayers, who I think...
A man who's been in the news of late.
Who's been in the news. Vice President Pence's chief of staff turned down Donald Trump's
on his way back to Georgia.
Let's look in the crystal ball. Keep an eye on Mr. Nick Ayers in future Georgia politics. But we love that, and we've expanded. We have a lot of Democrats that appreciate the fact that we allow them access with columns, and our reporters interview them. Bob Trammell was honored by James Magazine as a Lawmaker of the Year. We just talked about Bob, who's a very good leader of the loyal opposition, I have to say. And by the way, he was a fellow member of the Demosthenian Society.
There you go.
A Georgia Bulldog.
We've brought it full circle. Well, Mr. Kent, thank you very much on behalf of the Richard B. Russell Library at the University of Georgia for sitting down for this two-party Georgia oral history interview. I really do appreciate it, sir.
Thank you, Ashton.
Thank you.